Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy by the Takshashila Institution. I'm your host, Carl Jason, and today I've got a very interesting guest with me. I've got Srishti Joshi, who's currently a lawyer working as a senior associate at the Koan Advisory Group, a New Delhi-based policy advisory firm. Srishti specializes in data protection, platform governance, digital competition, and regulation of emerging technologies like AI. Prior to joining Koan, she worked at the Center for Communication Governance, NLU Delhi, as a project officer. She has also worked with the Microsoft Cloud Legal Project, Queen Mary University of London, as a research assistant. Srishti, such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for having me here today.
Yeah, so just a bit of background for the listeners. So Srishti, along with her colleague at Koan, Vaivan Sharan, had published an article in the Hindustan Times. And I'll be sure to sort of link this in the episode show notes, where they essentially argue for sub-licensing in the context of sports broadcasting rights, right? And we will get into some of the legal terms and, how do we navigate around that, which I thought was very interesting, especially, I think it's been about 2 weeks since the article was published, but it was during the height of the Olympics coverage, right?
Right.
And so there was certainly a lot to discuss at that point of time. But now that the Olympics is well behind us, I think we should certainly have some thoughts to sort of reflect on. So just to sort of get started on this, Srishti, so, as I mentioned, sports broadcasting has, sort of come a long way in the Indian sort of context. So if you could maybe just give us a sense of what prompted you both to sort of look at this particular space. And as we sort of progress on our conversation, we'll sort of, bring in some historical sort of events and cases that have been fundamental to where we are as far as the debate is concerned. So maybe we'll just get started, like, a zoom out, sort of perspective from you, and then we can take it from there.
Right. No, thanks, Carl. I think that's a great question to start off with. So I think just for the listeners here, I think it's important to trace the history of where we got this right to watch sports for free. And why do we essentially have this provision, right? Is there a law that mandates it? Where does it stem from? And this is also the peg on which we base the article on. Like, we're questioning the relevance of an act, which I will talk about. And so just to put this into perspective, so it was back in 2005 when the Indian government decided that, certain sports of national importance, your marquee cricket and football tournaments should be broadcast for free to public, right, through your public TV channels or your public broadcaster, which is Prasar Bharati. So they essentially came up with a rule that said that any broadcaster that owned the rights to these events essentially had to share it with the public broadcaster, Prasar Bharati in this case again. But then obviously, as it usually happens, some big sports channels did not like it. I think it was ESPN and 10 Sports, which, did not really like this idea. And they thought it was not fair because they considered it to be an expropriation of their rightfully earned rights to broadcast these events, right? And they took the matter to the court, they challenged the rule, and eventually the court came down and put a stay on this rule. Right now, to get around this, what the Indian government did was that they essentially brought out a new law, right? They brought out the Sports Act 2007, which Vivan and I also talk about in our piece, so essentially the Sports Act was brought in as a sports-friendly legislation, the whole idea of bringing sports to the masses, increasing accessibility to people who could not afford pay TV at that time, right? And this is back in 2007, 2006. What does the law provide? The law says that all broadcasters had to share their sports content with Prasar Bharati if that sporting event was deemed to be of national importance, right? So, if they didn't, I mean, they could get into trouble, right? They could lose out on their license. They could even run the risk of getting fined. Uh, Now, one big problem with the whole idea of, identifying these important or sports of national importance was that people were still confused about the applicability of the law on which sporting events, right? Because the government had not defined what these sports were exactly. The government later tried to clarify it through a list. However, the process in which they did this was not consultative. So the two key departments which were involved, or the ministries which were involved, were the Ministry of Sports and Youth Affairs and the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And neither of the ministries really consulted stakeholders, your sports organizations, TV channels for their opinions, and made like this arbitrary list of national events. Now, the problem there is that it's not very well executed. Just, before I conclude this question, is that just to give you an example, is that, for example, I think in around 2022, MIB came up with a notification which accidentally notified a hockey tournament which had already concluded in 2005, right? And it was still marked as a sport of national importance. And stakeholders, private broadcasters, people who were in the know-how wrote to the ministry and asked them to take this down, right? But they still continued to do that subsequently as well. Like, the list was always showing the same event marked as a sport of national importance. So, this is the idea behind, the Sports Act. And I can talk to you more about how we question the idea of the Sports Act completely.
Yeah. No, yeah, we certainly like to know the intricacies of the Sports Act. But Srishti, thanks for setting the context, right? Because
Yeah.
I wanted to go a little further back, because when the first broadcast was done for the Asian Games in 1982, this was completely exclusively for Prasar Bharati. It was for Doordarshan. Only Doordarshan could broadcast the Asian Games. And yeah, for a lot of the Indians who used to watch cricket back then, they were lucky to have also seen live in color
Yeah.
the 1983 World Cup victory. So when this whole sports broadcasting scene burst into the frame, it was Doordarshan that had virtual monopoly, right, over broadcasting.
Yeah.
And there's a very interesting thing here, which I also want to tell the listeners, that back then the BCCI had to pay a production fee,
Yes.
and which was around about rupees 5 lakhs for each live telecast.
Yes.
But yeah, that tells you something about where we are as far as today's sort of landscape is concerned. And I think what really set the ball rolling in terms of broadcasting and its implications for Prasar Bharati was the CAB case, which I think lawyers like yourself would know. It was the BCCI versus Prasar Bharati, where I think Supreme Court ruled that airwaves and frequency, while they were public property, Doordarshan had no exclusive monopoly over this, and they seem to take the view that broadcasting needs to have a spectrum of views. There needs to be plurality of sort of opinions and channels for the viewers.
Yes.
And then, cut to 97 is when the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, TRAI, sort of came into being. And they essentially were going to be that regulatory body which controlled, the interests of the public, or, wanted to protect the interests of the public in what was a very different regulatory environment, right? And the case that you mentioned in 2006. So this was in the backdrop of the India-Pakistan bilateral series. And there's a very interesting section about this in Nandan Kamath's book, which I'm sure most of our listeners would know by now. But I still mention it's the boundary lab inside the global experiment called sport. So Nandan goes into a lot of detail, and I think it's great supplementary reading if you're interested in this topic. So he actually tells us a little bit more about how this case panned out. So, the Madras High Court effectively ruled, right, at the back of this writ petition, that it was broadcast rights are essentially subservient to the larger public interest. So they in fact went on to argue that 10 Sports had to share its broadcast feed because these intermediaries only had secondary rights. So essentially it was something that already vests in the Indian public. And the Indian public is the one that has primary rights over this, which is just like fascinating, right? How things have panned out, since the 1980s to the 90s, where the regulatory environment changes, and then you come to the 2000s,
Right.
where there's a different sort of picture as far as broadcasting is concerned. So, Mike, question, sort of stemming from this would be, what are the problems with such regimes, right? So, you mentioned about the act, and is it the sports broadcasting signals? Is that the one?
Yeah, the mandatory sharing signals with Prasar Bharati Act 2007. Yeah.
Yeah, the act has also been defined in no uncertain terms. It actually says mandatory sharing with Prasar Bharati
Or
Act.
as explicit as it can get. Yeah.
Yeah, that's as explicit as it can get.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share with us as to what are some of the problems with having such regimes, and how does this affect not just profitability but viewing experience for people who've people who would like to sort of get the best quality access to the sports that they watch.
Right. No, thanks, Carl. I think what I can do is then probably also talk about like the key question that you asked, right? Like, where's the failure in these kind of regulatory regimes in terms of being cognizant of the landscape in which they're going to be working in as well, right? So, even the peg with the article was that, with this massive growth in like sports infra, and I'm only talking about sports infra from the POV of all the leagues that have propped up now in India, right? This interest in sporting culture now in India, like, you wouldn't have thought that there could be a pro kabaddi league a few decades back. Now you have an active pro kabaddi league where even players from the UK come to India, right, to train their national team. And also in terms of accessibility, right, which is now sorted because of you have more affordable access to broadband and internet connectivity. So the question that I'm going to be asking is, even the relevance of the act itself has to be questioned now. The broadcasting landscape in which this act is currently working with has gone through massive changes, right? So back in 2007, when the act was actually introduced, sports was definitely not as easy as it is right now to watch, right, in terms of accessibility as well. And rather, not accessibility in terms of watching, but the choice, right? So people relied on Doordarshan, and whatever was showing was what they had access to, right? Pay TV cost was obviously very high, and DD had almost established this unshakable reach close to like 98%. And this is what I'm talking about, what was actually discussed in Parliament in 2007 when the Act was introduced, right? The landscape was very different. Obviously, to solve this, the government brought in the Act and mandated like these private broadcasters to share the live feed of these matches, right? But the broadcasting landscape has changed now. I mean, India has close to more than 800 TV channels now, and most of them actively broadcast sports content. Plus, you also have the option of watching it on streaming platforms, right? Your OTT streaming services like Hotstar, Geo Cinema, that offer not just a variety in the kind of sports content that there is, but also in terms of affordability, right? Most of them do function on a freemium model. And also in terms of the viewer experience, right? You have interactive feeds during matches. You have immersive technology that these broadcasters have developed, like, there's like slow motion camera. I mean, the catch, right, in the World Cup, like that was like actually captured because of the technology that has been innovated by these private broadcasters.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think when you ask about the relevance, the kind of what are they trying to solve for. Like, I question the relevance of the act itself right now, because I do think that it is outdated, and I do think that the kind of atmosphere, the environment that they're working under right now is not relevant. I mean, you've solved the issue of accessibility through all these measures of affordable broadband, internet accessibility, right? And I think the original goal, even with the Sports Act, of bringing sports to the masses has actually been achieved, right? So you spoke about sub licensing as well, like when you were talking about how things have evolved in this space. And Vivan and I talk about two very, very good examples there, right? Like, we say that India should probably look at global practices, right? What are other countries doing? For example, UK, the public broadcaster, BBC, in their case, has the option of working with private broadcasters wherein they sub-license, where if let's say a private broadcaster does have the right to stream or air certain matches, they can share it and they can sub-license it to the broadcaster. So let's say out of a total of 26 matches, the public broadcaster has the right to air maybe 10 or like 7, right? So I think that level of flexibility is something that maybe we should also be striving towards, because there are a lot of benefits that private broadcasters have definitely brought into the sports ecosystem.
Sure, yeah.
Really.
And in the UK context, is it still live feed or is there a delay in the feed?
So the UK has two feeds. One is your live feed, which has to be shared, and then you have the recorded stream as well, like which they have to share. So they have the flexibility of both options in that case. And it depends upon each sub-licensing deal on what the public broadcaster and what the private broadcaster agree upon, in terms of which are the matches that they want to air and which are the ones that they want to not air with the public broadcaster. So I think there's a lot of flexibility on that level as well, which I think, I mean, if you want to keep pace with things of how things are moving, I think it's important for us also to take into consideration the relevance of like such acts.
Yeah, I think the other equilibrium that I see that has emerged is that these broadcasters buy rights, the media rights, and they effectively pass on these costs to advertisers, right, or even subscribers. So you're looking at a scenario where the public broadcaster, I mean, talking about the Indian context at this point, don't underwrite the costs. And the private broadcaster, despite losing the exclusivity of rights, is still able to pass on the cost to, as I said, the advertisers and the subscribers. So you've reached an equilibrium where I feel even reimagining this law, to my mind, seems to be a very arduous sort of task, because the private broadcasters just want to recoup, right, from what they have sort of invested in these rights. But I sense a potential fallout too, which is how do you enhance the quality, right, of the broadcasting?
Would this be for the public broadcaster, or would this be for the
Private? Yeah, what does this mean for the private broadcast? Because the private broadcaster is able to recoup its investments from the media rights. What is it that needs to change? Like, so what is wrong in giving it? And just to play the devil's advocate here, right? So what is wrong in giving it to the public broadcaster if that can reach a lot more people?
I mean, so then you'll have to put it into perspective.
Sorry, I must add, I don't agree with this view. I just want to put this out there just so that we can have a reasonable
but I
conversation.
mean, this is important for deliberation as well, right? But I think you'll have to see the trade-off, right? If you were to say that, okay, what are the benefits that this mandatory sharing provision will bring? And I mean, I still believe that the original intention that it had of bringing sports to the masses, I felt like that was noble and that was needed at that time. But then again, it's not required now because of the fact that, we have accessibility is largely dealt with by, your broadband, internet connectivity, and all that was what I was talking about. But I think, Carl, what's really important is that I think we need to also take a step back and see what kind of benefits have these private players brought to the overall sports ecosystem, right? I mean, I don't want to talk about cricket and IPL here because, I mean, we can go on, and there are like multiple articles for people to like refer to, right? But so when I was doing my research for this article, right, I had to look at like, okay, what is the actual windfall that actually happens? Is the money funneled back into the larger, broader sports ecosystem. And the examples that I found were very, very, very encouraging, like, because I mean, I'll not refute that India is obsessed with cricket and we do have, this, but we also do have now this whole new world where leagues prop up, as I was mentioning, kabaddi, football, hockey, wrestling, and they're just not fun to watch. And obviously they are, some of them are indigenous sports as well, but they are also big businesses. We've seen like a steady inflow of foreign domestic investments in these leagues, where money is actually being poured into the Indian leagues, right? Be it Atletico Madrid, I think, which invested in Atletico Kolkata, and City Football Group, which did assume majority ownership in Mumbai City FC, right?
Mumbai City.
I mean, these examples do give us an idea about the global appeal of these events, even though they are just at a very, very nascent stage, right? And I think the most important contribution, when I try to see the trade off between mandatory sharing and not sharing and building the sports ecosystem through these kind of leagues, right? Private broadcasters actually put a lot of money into the kind of the auctions that happen, and the money then obviously flows down to the sports ecosystem. And for me, the most encouraging thing is that it provides financial stability to these athletes, in sports, right, which is a very financially unstable sort of a profession, right? We found crazy new talent from, like, for, let's say, non-cricketing geographies for the IPL, which wherein previously it would have been impossible to do so without the kind of support these guys bring into these leagues. And I gave the example of the Pro Kabaddi League players from England, the national team coming to India to practice, right? So I mean, what's the big deal about like all of this, right? I think the way we watch sports in India is changing. It's bringing new opportunities. It's bringing, it's not just filling the coffers of like the boards, but it's also actually funneling back to the players also. And also, so I know I don't want to bring up the example of IPL, but something that you have to commend them for is that they also have social welfare schemes. They have like pension programs for their retired umpires now.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's impressive, right? Like, so, I mean, these are just some of the factors which just show that I think India has become a more exciting place for sports now. And I would have to say that the private players have a lot of role to play in this. And definitely, like, when you think about the mandatory sharing provision and what benefits it was, I would still say that the trade-off, in this case, I would still side with the private guys, because of the fact that the benefits have funneled much, much better all over the country.
Yeah, and I think it's also it speaks to how profit is reinvested back, which then further develops the sport. It sort of builds out the ecosystem. So, is there an argument to make for the government? Right, I'm sort of let's probably just refer to them as the government, and the government's role as far as being involved in sports in general is concerned, not just in broadcasting, would be to build the grassroots ecosystem. Right. So how to ensure that the infrastructure, your athlete development programs. So I think we did see that play out in the context of the Olympics, where a lot of the athletes came through the Khelo India program. The Olympics podium scheme, for instance, TOPS, what it popularly called as. So that's interesting, right? Because the public broadcast argument is very weak, and I don't think people can even hold on to the view that private broadcasters are charging a hefty premium, which, as I mentioned a little while earlier, is not the case, because it's passed on to advertisers, and advertising is such a big space, right? And I have some numbers here where the single biggest source of revenue for, as far as broadcasting and media rights, is between 55 to 70%, right? And that's the major chunk. And then there's sponsorships, there's all the other revenue streams that come with it. So yeah, I mean, despite my failed attempts at trying to find some reason in the mandatory sharing provisions, I can't bring myself to sort of side with with this particular law. How do you foresee this evolving going forward, right? Because see, the landscape has changed. I think the government will come to the realization that there's a very different beast that you're dealing with today, the sports the industry, the fan base, etc. So, sort of to round up our conversation, could you maybe tell us what are some possible solutions for this? You alluded to the sub-licensing deal in the UK.
Yeah.
Are there other global best practices, for instance, that India can sort of learn from, while also ensuring that like the public is able to watch this without without a prohibitive cost attached to it?
Right. So I think when I think about this issue of mandatory sharing, right, I have like the problem in my mind is that whatever solution we have to think of has to benefit the public as
Sure.
as a whole, right? But it also has to then respect the private rights of these broadcasters who have actually pulled in money to invest in the sport, right? And I think also the question on accessibility and also building the larger sporting culture in India and generating interest, thinking of new exciting formats in which you can show this content, investing in technology. I think the answer is definitely in the suggestion that we've also given, is that if you do have a mandatory sharing requirement, if the government does not think of revising or doing away, like, I mean, ideal situation would be we would not have a mandatory sharing provision, right? But if we do have a mandatory sharing provision, explore ways in which you can have better collaboration with private players, right? Through these sub-licensing deals. I mean, if you want to take a free market approach, you can look at the US, but I mean, that's not like going to fly. But then you also,
That's not going to fly either.
but I mean, so in when we were deliberating upon the piece as well, like we found that explore ways in which you can build this kind of collaboration with private broadcasters, because there's a lot of benefits that actually does flow just on the basis of what they show, the kind of the kind of content they put out, right? So sub-licensing would definitely be on top, like if we were to stick with the whole regime of having a mandatory sharing provision.
Then makes sense. I think one of the things I want to sort of mention here as we sort of close is and you also spoken and you also mentioned this in the article, right? And which kind of struck me is just going beyond the public private broadcaster. The sports content space itself has just evolved like so much, right? So from social media
Absolutely.
to podcasts to videos. I mean, I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm quite sure that majority of people would have watched the Surya Kumar Yadav catch in T20 World Cup on social media.
Exactly.
It was not on the channel that had bought the rights, or not even on Doordarshan for that matter. In fact, I don't even know whether it was airing in Doordarshan, which I'm assuming it did, because I'm sure it was an event of national importance. So to me, I think the private broadcasters have a lot more to lose from this infringement, right? That now content creators are, the fans themselves. I mean, they post content on social media, which technically does infringe on like the copyrights. It seems to me that it's a double-edged sword. Because you do want to bring the best live content to the sports fan, but there's also this ubiquity of content, right, which you spoke about. So, any thoughts on that, and then we can sort of wrap up this conversation.
Yeah, I think so even in this, right, I think the consideration is that if you were to take into consideration like what is important from the POV of, let's say, a broadcaster who has acquired the right. For them, I think the key thing would definitely be the live feed, right? Because that's also where you have the ads that you show, the pre-roll, post-roll ads that you show, and the kind of ad revenue that is generated, right, from there. So I think from that POV, I think it's important that the live feed is not shared. I think the implications of us circulating a photo of Surya Kumar Yadav's catch, I think that's always going to be there, like no matter what kind of restrictions you put in, because of the ubiquity of technology, right, like that you were talking about. It's always going to multiply in some way or the other. But if I were to point out a concern here, in terms of like the relevance of the conversation we're having here, I think the key thing is that the concern on mandatory sharing of these live feeds, I think that's where the concern is, definitely, because also that's where the money is, right? Like, how are you able to show that you've brought in like millions and millions of people to watch a match? I think so. For me, I think the concern would still be there.
Yeah. So I think you're mentioning about illegal streaming, right? And I think this is actually a major problem in the UK. So while, yeah, sure, the sub licensing deals have worked in their favor, it's very difficult, for instance, to watch an English Premier League match in the UK because the costs are just prohibitive. At least from people that I know of who live there and watch football. Srishti, thanks so much for sparing time to have a conversation with me. I'm sure we could have gotten into very different threads, both from your article and also from Nandan's book. But let's maybe have the listeners check these resources out. So let's not give away too much. Thank you so much. And hope to sort of speak to you when there is maybe even an update or maybe a provision that is added. And and we will sort of refer to your article for having made the case. And we'll sort of maybe have a conversation if there are developments in this space in the future. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Karl, for having me. Thanks.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.